The new bride admitted she wasn't the pretty one he had paid good money for. The letter arrived on a Thursday. I know it was a Thursday because that was the day Horace Dunbar ran the mail up from Redfield, and Horace only did it once a week, and I'd been watching the road since Monday. Not anxious, I want to be clear about that. I'm not an anxious man by nature. I'd spent 11 years doing work for the army that required a man to be the opposite of anxious, and whatever that word is, that's what I was. I watched the road the way you watch water in a kettle, not needing it to boil, just keeping track. The letter said she was coming on the Wednesday stage. It gave her name, Clara Hess, and said she was 26, dark-haired, accomplished in domestic work, had been educated through the 8th standard, and was, the agency's words, a woman of pleasing appearance and agreeable disposition. I read that twice. Pleasing appearance. I'd paid the agency $42. $42 was not a small sum in 1874, not for a man who'd come back from the Modoc country with nothing but the clothes he stood in and a piece of his left ear that wasn't there anymore. I'd worked 2 years on Calhoun spread to put that ranch back into something livable, and I was 39 years old, and I'd decided, not desperately, but with the flat practicality of a man who's finished pretending he doesn't need things, that I wanted a wife, a companion, someone to share the table with, someone who wouldn't leave at spring thaw. I sent $42 to the Continental Marriage Agency out of Omaha and described myself as best I could. Rancher, former Army scout, 39, some land, some cattle, no debts. I did not mention the ear. They sent me Clara Hess. Or so I believed. The Wednesday stage came in at 3:15. I was standing at the edge of the platform at Redfield's so-called depot, which was a covered overhang with 2 benches and a nail keg that served as a third. There were 4 passengers, 2 men I knew by sight, a drummer and a land assessor who came through every fall, 1 woman who descended the step with the assistance of a man I took to be her husband, and then a 4th. She stepped down without help. That was the first thing I noticed. Not that she was or wasn't what I expected, just that she stepped down off that stage like she'd been stepping off things all her life and hadn't yet required assistance and wasn't about to start. She was carrying a canvas bag over one shoulder and a small wooden case in the other hand, and she was looking around the platform with the calm, cataloging look of a woman who'd learned to take inventory of a new place before committing to it. She was not what the letter had described as a woman of pleasing appearance. She was plain, strong-faced, jaw maybe too square for the painters, a nose that had been broken once from the slight bend in it. Her hair was the color of wet creek mud. She wore a gray dress that had been let out and re-hemmed and let out again, which you could see if you looked at the seams, and she was looking at me the same way I was looking at her, measuring. Not unkind, but not pretending either. I took off my hat. She said, "You're Ilya's cord." I said I was. She said, "My name is Nora Hess. I'm Clara's older sister. Clara decided not to come. She met someone in Omaha with more prospects." A pause. "The agency sent me instead. I don't know if they told you." They had not told me. I stood there with my hat in my hands, and the September dust blowing off the street, and the drummer hauling his sample case past us both. She said, "I understand if you want your money back." I wrote to the agency telling them it wasn't proper to send me in her place without asking you first, but they'd already cashed your draft. I can try to get it returned, though I suspect you'll have better luck writing to them yourself. She set her wooden case down, just set it right there on the platform boards, and looked at me straight. "I'm 34 years old. I'm a school teacher. I've been teaching in a one-room school in Cass County for 9 years, and the county just replaced me with a man who'll work for less. I have no family left except Clara, and Clara's circumstances are—" She stopped. "I'm not here to mislead you. I'm not young, and I'm not what you ordered. But I can work, I can cook, I can manage accounts, and I'm not looking for someone to carry me." I put my hat back on. I said, "You eaten?" She blinked, then she said no. I picked up her wooden case. She kept the canvas bag. We walked across the street to the Prairie Rose, which was the only place in Redfield that served a sit-down meal, and we ate venison stew and bread, and I paid for it. And neither of us talked much. And when we were done, I told her I had a wagon outside and that it was 14 miles to the ranch, and that she should tell me now if she wanted to go back. Because once we started out, I wasn't going to stop and argue about it in the dark. She said, "Then we'd better start." I want to be fair to myself about what I was thinking on that drive out. I was not thinking it was fine. I was not thinking it was an adventure or that the Lord had his mysterious ways or any of that. I'd paid $42 for a wife and been sent a woman I hadn't contracted for, and I was a man who believed in the plain meaning of an agreement, and this arrangement had not been agreed to. I was thinking I'd have to write to Omaha. I was thinking I'd possibly have to hire a lawyer. I was thinking about the $42. And then I was thinking about the way she'd looked at me on that platform. Even-eyed. No apology in it and no bravado either. Just here's the situation, here are the facts, here's what I don't know, and here's what I do. She sat on the wagon seat beside me with her hands in her lap and watched the country go by. Prairie at that time of year has a tired color, like old straw, and the light was already going orange in the west. There were antelope moving on the ridge to the north, 6 or 7 of them, and she noticed them before I did and didn't say anything about it, just turned her head and watched them until they went over the ridge. I said, "You from Kansas originally?" She said, "Iowa, Harlan. My father ran a hardware store, closed when I was 20, and after that, the pause. After that, I was a school teacher." The way she said, "and after that," the way she landed on school teacher, told me there was something between the hardware store closing and the teaching she wasn't going to tell me about. At least not in a wagon on a first evening, and that was fine. A person was allowed their own history. I told her the ranch had a main house, 2 bedrooms, and that I'd give her the second room, and that we weren't married yet and didn't have to be until she'd had a look at the place and decided if she could stand it. She said, "You're not what I expected either." I said, "What did you expect?" She said, "The agency described you as a frontier laborer seeking domestic arrangement." I said, "They described you as pleasing appearance and agreeable disposition." She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh but was in the neighborhood. She said, "Well, I'll give them agreeable disposition." We got in after dark. I lit the lamps and showed her the house. I watched her take it in: the main room, the cook stove, the table I'd built myself from cottonwood planks, the 2 bedrooms, the puncheon floor I'd put in 2 springs ago. She was quiet, not the quiet of disapproval, the quiet of a person looking hard at a thing and filing it away accurately. She found a loose nail in the porch step with her foot on the way in and asked if I had a hammer. I said I did. She said, "I'll get it in the morning." I showed her her room. It had a bed, a chest of drawers, a window facing east. She thanked me. I went to my room and lay there listening to the quiet of the house, which sounded different with someone else in it. Not uncomfortable, different. Like the house had been holding its breath for a while and had now let a little of it go. In the morning, she was up before me. I'm not used to that. I'm an early riser, have been my whole life, come from the Army habit of first light being first light, and in 11 years alone on that ranch, I'd never once come out to find the stove already going. I came out and she was at the cook stove, and there was coffee, and the loose nail in the porch step had been hammered in, and she had found the skillet and the flour bin and was making flat cakes from cornmeal. I sat down at the table. She said without turning around, "I found salt pork in the cellar. I used some. Is that all right?" I said it was. She turned and handed me a cup of coffee and went back to the stove. I watched her work. She moved the way competent people move, no wasted motion, nothing performed, just the job and then the next job. She hadn't unpacked her bags yet, but she'd already figured out my kitchen. I drank the coffee. It was better than mine, I didn't mention that. She sat across from me and we ate the flat cakes and the pork and drank the coffee, and I told her about the place, how many head, where the water was, what needed doing before winter which was coming fast. I was matter-of-fact about it. She was matter-of-fact back. She asked good questions, practical ones. She asked about the nearest doctor and the nearest school and the post, and then she said, "Do you have any hired help?" I said I'd had a man named Ruiz, but he'd gone to Deadwood, and I hadn't replaced him. She said, "You're running this alone." I said yes. She looked at me with those even gray eyes and said, "That's too much for one person." I said I'd been managing. She said, "I didn't say you weren't managing. I said it was too much." I want to tell you about the first week, because the first week tells you a lot. She worked. That's the first and most important thing. From first light to last, she worked. She put up 2 more window plugs against the coming cold. She found the broken fence on the east pasture that I'd been meaning to get to for a month and mended it herself. Not well, she wasn't a fence hand, but well enough, and she came in with her hands raw and didn't make anything of it. She went through my supply stores and made a list of what was needed, and the list was accurate. She could figure sums in her head faster than I could on paper. She was not easy. I want to say that too. She had opinions and she stated them, and she didn't shrink from disagreement. On the 4th day I told her I'd been considering selling the north pasture. The land was marginal and the price was fair, and she said she thought that was wrong and told me why. The soil was better than I thought. She'd walked it. If I held it through the winter and got a proper figure on it in spring, I could ask more. She was right. I knew she was right when she said it, and that irritated me slightly, not because of her, but because I'd been making decisions alone for long enough that having someone push back felt strange. Like a muscle, you forget you have until someone presses on it. By the end of the first week, I had forgotten she wasn't the woman I'd sent for. I don't mean I forgot she existed. I mean the distinction, the original arrangement, Clara, the $42, the misunderstanding. It had just stopped mattering in any practical way. She was here. She worked. She was honest. She made better coffee than me. The house didn't hold its breath anymore. The second week, a man came by. His name was Prentice, and he ran a decent-sized spread about 8 miles south, and he was the kind of man who seems reasonable and turns out not to be. He came to sell me a bull he claimed was 4 years old and sound in all 4 feet. The bull was 6 and had a front hoof that needed work. I told Prentice that. He said I was mistaken. I said I wasn't. He said maybe the lady would like to look at it, gesturing at Nora, who'd come to stand in the doorway when she heard the wagon, as if that were a cutting remark, as if her looking at it would confirm my foolishness. Nora walked out to the pen, looked at the bull for about 15 seconds and said, "He's not mistaken." Prentice reddened. He said to me, "You letting a woman do your buying now, Cord?" I said, "She's telling you what I already told you." He said some other things. I won't repeat them. He left without selling me anything, and when he was gone I looked at Nora and she looked at me and she said, "He'll come back when he needs something." She was right about that too. I don't know exactly when I understood that she had changed the shape of my life. It wasn't a single moment. It was more like the way daylight comes in October, not a line you cross but a slow change in the quality of everything. October, that's when it shifted. There was a night, middle of the month. We'd had a first freeze and then a warm-up, and that night was warm enough to sit on the porch after supper. She'd brought her mending out. I had my pipe. We sat there in the last of the warm air and watched the dark come in over the prairie, and somewhere out north a coyote started in, that long wavering sound, and she said, not to me, mostly just out, "I used to be afraid of that sound. Coyotes. When I first came west." I said, "And now?" She said, "Now it just sounds like the country talking." I looked at her sitting there in the lamplight that came through the window, her hands steady on the mending, her face turned toward the dark, and something settled in me. Something that had been sitting sideways for a long time. I said, "You didn't have to stay." She didn't look up from the mending. She said, "I know." I said, "The agency arrangement. Nobody would have thought the worse of you for going back." She put the mending down in her lap. She looked at me then, level and straight. She said, "I know that too." I said, "So why did you?" She was quiet for a moment. The coyote called again, farther north now. She said, "Because you picked up my case on that platform without making a production of it, and you took me to eat without asking me to earn it first, and you gave me a room with an east-facing window and let me be." She paused. Men don't generally do all three of those things. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. She picked the mending back up. She said, "And because the work is real here, this is a real place. I've been in places that were just waiting to fall down." She glanced at the house behind us, and something in her expression, not sentimental, just factual, said she decided this one wasn't. This one is worth working for. I wrote to the agency in November. I told them I was withdrawing my complaint and that the substitution had been resolved to my satisfaction. I did not ask for the $42 back. It seemed beside the point. We married on the 21st of November in Redfield, in front of the Justice of the Peace. No ceremony beyond what was required. Nora wore the gray dress she'd arrived in because it was the better of her two, and she said spending on a dress for a 10-minute proceeding was wasteful. I thought she looked fine in it. The JP asked me if I took this woman, and I said yes, and he asked her and she said yes, and that was the contract. After we had dinner at the Prairie Rose again, same venison stew, she said the cook had improved. I said I'd tell him. She said, "Don't, he'll raise his prices." There is a thing that happened in December that I have not told many people. It was the week before Christmas. I'd gone out in the morning to check the east water trough, which had a tendency to freeze solid if I didn't break the ice early, and I slipped on the bank. There'd been a hard freeze overnight and then a light melt and refreeze, and the mud was a sheet of ice, and I went down hard on my left side. I heard something go in my ribs. Not a crack, more a wet give, which is worse. I lay there for a moment getting my breath back, and then I got up because there wasn't anything else to do, and I walked back to the house, and by the time I got to the door I was having trouble standing straight. Nora was at the stove. She looked at me once and said, "Sit down." I said I was fine. She said, "Elias," just my name, one word, and something in the way she said it, not commanding, not frightened, just present and certain, made me sit down. She ran her hands along my ribs, gently but without hesitation. She said, "At least 2, maybe 3. She went to the cellar and came back with rags she'd soaked in cold water and folded them against my side, and she strapped them in place with strips of linen, and she told me to stay in the chair. I said I had stock to see to. She said, "I'll see to them." I said she didn't know the routine. She said, "You'll tell me the routine." I told her the routine. She put on my coat over hers and went out and did it, all of it, in the cold. I sat in the chair by the stove and listened to the wind and the distant sounds of her work, and I felt, I don't have a good word for it. Grateful is too small. It was more like the feeling of setting something down you'd been carrying so long you'd stopped noticing the weight. She came in an hour later with cold hands and chapped lips and the smell of the barn on her coat, and she hung the coat up and came to check my strapping and pull it a little tighter, and I reached out and took her hand. She stopped. I held her hand, that was all. I didn't say anything. My ribs hurt and the wind was picking up outside and the stove was ticking with the cold, and she stood there and let me hold her hand, and after a moment she turned it over in mine and held back. She said, "You're going to be all right." She wasn't just talking about the ribs. I know what I looked like to people in those years. I know what Prentice thought when he rode by. A broken-down scout with a missing piece of ear and a ranch that was always one bad winter from going under. A man who'd been passed over and passed by and had enough stubborn in him to keep working but not enough shine to attract much else. I'd had a life that wore on me visibly. I knew it. Nora never treated me like any of that. She treated me like a man who had built something worth building and was still building it and knew what he was doing. She treated me like my opinion was worth having and my judgment was worth trusting. She pushed back when she thought I was wrong, which wasn't nothing. I'd rather have a person who argues back than one who just nods. But in the arguments and outside them, there was never a moment when I felt like she was tolerating me. There was never a moment when I felt like she was there, because there was nowhere else to go. She was there because she chose to be. She'd had that platform conversation with me in the first 30 seconds, set her case down, looked at me straight, and made her calculation. And then she'd gone on choosing, day after day, with the same even deliberateness she brought to everything. That matters. Maybe it only matters the way it did to me because of what I'd come from. 11 years of being the man you sent into hard country but didn't invite to the table after. 11 years of being useful in the way a tool is useful, set down when the work was done. But it mattered. It was the thing I hadn't known I was missing until I had it, and then I couldn't imagine having been without it. Spring came. Second spring, I mean the spring after we married. The north pasture came through the winter in better shape than I'd expected. The grass was good. I got 3 offers on it by April, and I held out, and in May I got a number worth taking and I took it. Nora sat across the table from me when I wrote out the agreement, and when I was done she looked at it and said the figure was right. I said, "You knew it would be." She said, "I thought it would be." I said, "Same thing." She gave me the look she gave me when she thought I was being smug. It was a particular look, slight narrowing of the left eye, small press of the lips, and I'd come to find it funny, which she knew, and knowing it she tried not to give it to me but sometimes couldn't help it. She couldn't help it that time. I folded the agreement. Outside the window the pasture was going green in the long afternoon light, and the land ran out flat toward the hills to the west, and I could see 3 of my horses moving in the south field, and everything out there was mine, worked for, paid for, stayed for. Ours now. There is not a lot of ceremony to the kind of life we led. I want to say that because I think people sometimes expect a story like this to end in some declaration, some moment that makes clear what was meant all along. We didn't have that. What we had was better. We had 11 years, we have them still, God willing, of mornings with the stove going and coffee better than mine and a voice in the next room, and the small true fact of not being alone in the work. Some nights I sit on the porch the way we sat that first October, and she brings her mending out and I have my pipe and the coyotes carry on to the north, and I think about that platform in Redfield, the dust, the drummer with his sample case, the woman who stepped off the stage without waiting for help and looked around like she was taking inventory. I think about her setting her case down on those boards, the flat, honest way she said what she said. I think about how I picked up that case without really deciding to. I've thought sometimes about Clara, the woman I'd paid for, the one with the pleasing appearance and the prospects in Omaha. I don't bear her any grudge. She did me a better turn than she knew. What the agency sent me in the end was a woman who looked at a worn-down ranch and a worn-down man and saw something worth staying for. I was 57 years old before I understood what it meant to have that. To have someone know the worst of the accounts and the worst of the weather and the worst of the year and choose to stay anyway. Not out of obligation, not because she had nowhere else, but because she looked at the whole of it and decided it was worth her time. A man could work 40 years and not earn that. I just had to wait for Horace Dunbar's Thursday mail.